Hi, this is Paul. I spent yesterday at classis meeting. Most of you don't know what that means. Classis is a word that comes from a Dutch word that basically means a fleet. And what a classis is in the Christian Reformed Church is the regional middle judiciary of our denomination. In other words, I met with pastors and elders and deacons from various other churches in Northern California in my denomination. Had a couple of examinations, but if there is a time when I feel all of the different pressures of the culture localized, it's often at classis. I just had a conversation with a colleague this morning about that. It's quite a you feel a lot of the cross pressures in a place like classis. Someone left really a pretty remarkable comment about audience capture avoidance, and I couldn't find it, otherwise I would read it as such. I thought it was an excellent comment. And they just talked about the fact that I think this person was right. I've got colleagues in the church. I've got a church that is significantly African American in a very poor part of an extraordinarily diverse, racially diverse community, black friends and white friends, significant time in Latin America, grew up how I did, on and on and on and on and on. I've just got all of these things in my head and voices in my head that don't really let me land one way or another easily in any of the dominant camps we find warring in the culture. And so part of what I do in these videos is someone once said to me that your conversation videos are really therapy. Well, my monologue videos are therapy too, but y'all are the therapist. A friend of mine from let's say the Christian Reformed Progressives sent me this podcast of Tom Holland because she knew I do a lot of things about Tom Holland, and Tom Holland made a comment about young people aren't leaving Christianity. Well, they are leaving the church. And this was from Ploughcast. And once I saw the branding of it, I sort of immediately intuited, I may be wrong, I did a little bit of wondering that this is the remnant Anabaptist religious publication. And sure enough, it's a magazine that has a podcast. Magazines are dead. Long live podcasting. Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I think, is a hope of Christianity today that it has a future beyond the paper magazine. Paper magazines haven't gone away, but paper magazines are not what they were before the rise of the blog and the internet. And now podcasting is the new hotness. And so every magazine worth its salt has multiple podcasts and is trying to go in that direction. And blogs have it too. And many major online magazines have buttons where you can hear the article read to you, etc., etc., etc. Old principalities continue to have their impacts in the world, and Anabaptism is actually quite a difficult principality or tradition to track in our consciousness duopoly. What do I mean by our consciousness duopoly? I've made the point before that consciousness is sort of a field, and it's very monofocal. And because it's monofocal, we tend to reduce the world into dualities, because that's how sort of we can compare. And monofocality can engage more than one system. So then you have a duopoly or a dualism. And so we tend to always reduce into the world into dualisms, right and left. It becomes very low resolution. It becomes very easy to track. And I mentioned to my colleague this morning that it's an interesting thing that in my denomination, at least those who know about me, I'm sort of a conservative hero because I haven't just marched in lockstep with the progressives. And for that reason, for some progressives, I'm a traitor because I haven't marched in lockstep with progressives. But I'm a strange kind of conservative where I'm not all that conservative in a whole bunch of things. And of course, that's what the whole resolution metaphor is about. But we keep reducing the world into these duopolies, and Anabaptism also just does not fit into our right-left political culture war matrix. Now, it's, the more I read at least the sample of that book about the secularization of Quebec after my conversation with a young woman that I had on my channel. I posted that during my vacation. And it gave me a lot more insight into even Jonathan Pageau's story, because, of course, I meet Jonathan Pageau because I'm making videos about Jordan Peterson, and he's a personal friend of Jordan Peterson, and he's making videos about symbolism, and he's a Christian, and I'm a Christian. And what on earth is Jonathan Pageau talking about? And so in our first conversation, I do what I've always done on my channel, is I try and get at his story and get to know him. And, well, his parents were evangelical. They went evangelical after they were Roman Catholic, so they're French Canadian. And then he goes, of course, to art school and to Congo, and he goes with Mennonite Central Committee. And so there's real interesting ties between Jonathan Pageau and Anabaptism. But then, of course, he goes Orthodox, which, if you follow the conversation, sort of the tensions that now, as Jonathan Pageau rises in the ranks and he's less of a brand new thing, Christian anarchists, which I never knew existed before a year ago, Anabaptists, well, Christianity is revolutionary. No, Christianity is counter-revolutionary, and so that's why I did the video on, is Christianity revolutionary or not? All of those tensions are sort of in, or at least behind Pageau in some ways, because he's sort of come out in some ways on a certain side in some of these higher resolution conversations. But all of this stuff has been in Anabaptism right from the start. Anabaptists are the original Baptists. Most of the Baptists around are usually Calvinists or Arminians. And remember, you have the Protestant Reformation. There's lots of this stuff in the pre-Reformation period, in many of the pre-Reformation tendencies. So, of course, you have Luther, and then second generation, you have Calvin, and then you have Arminius, who breaks away from Calvin. Most Baptists you'll find will either be Reformed Baptists, which is like Calvinist Baptists, or Arminian Baptists. And then later on, of course, you've got Pentecostals and all of that. But the Anabaptists are really right there in there before the Calvinists. And they're right there at the front line of the Reformation. Some will tend to go a little Zwinglian, but Zwingli is much too magisterial for the Anabaptists. And part of this is because whereas in many ways what develops in a lot of Protestantism is sort of a rational reiteration, a rational reiterationism, let's say, or a rationalist reconstruction. The Anabaptists were sort of a physicalist reiteration. They would read the words of Jesus and do what Jesus said, as closely to the text as they were. If Jesus says, give your cloak, give your cloak. And that sort of leads to some of the pacifism. And so the Anabaptist tradition is a very interesting tradition and really grows parallel to the magisterial Reformation. They're often called the Radical Reformation. But there's incredible diversity within the Anabaptist tradition. You have strong tendencies of pacifism and long histories of social justice. In some ways, the abolitionists, and now abolitionism and Anabaptism in American culture are by no means synonymous, but abolitionism is in some ways, early abolitionism is in some ways a manifestation of some of that Anabaptist spirit. And so while some Anabaptists have gone very, very woke and very, very progressive, and it's in some ways very in keeping with their tradition, others are very conservative. Look at Julian in the channel. He's a Hutterite. And so you have, especially Hutterites in Canada, German immigrants who continue to practice their communitarian values. Now, is that progressive? Because are they sort of communists holding all things in common? Again, they are looking to literally recreate the dynamics of the book of Acts by sort of literally practicing. Gosh, I hate that word, and I wish I had a better one to use right now that would actually communicate. To practice it, and hopefully in practicing it and doing what Jesus says directly, then you can, in a sense, reappreciate, reiterate. God's Spirit comes down. You have the authentic Christianity, etc., etc., etc. That's Anabaptism. Now, if you go and look at, I should just pull up the website. So here's the magazine that has grown the podcast, and you can look at, see, there's so much mixing and matching. You've got an article by Russell Moore, but even in his Southern Baptist way, with some of the decisions that Russell Moore has been making, he's finding resonance with the Anabaptist community. There was Tara Isabella Burton, the Florentine option. And when you read this piece, there's some resonance with some elements of the Anabaptist community. So this is immigration. So Anabaptists are often, defenders of the poor, and so they'll be lining up with the immigrant and of course immigrants' rights. And so that sounds progressive in America, but it's these elements come up in the culture, into intentional community, homeschooling resources. And you wouldn't think, well, homeschoolers are reactionary or conservative, not Anabaptist. No, but you've got that here. And so you've got a lot of mixing going on in the culture. Now let's see if I can manage my little windows here, and there we go. So you've got a lot of mixing going on in the culture. And no, not yet. There we go. And narratives just don't fit. I sort of put that scramble, Donald Trump as Christian nationalism, which, certain progressive evangelicals have really been yelling. But hey, what about the Christian imperialism of the Democratic Party? And what's been happening is that there's a big scramble in there. And so you've got someone like Elizabeth Bruenig, and it's been fascinating watching the reaction in the comments section to Elizabeth Bruenig. Some people very, longtime commenters here saying, I've been following her and really appreciate her. Other people, she's a heretic. So you just watch this scramble. And you watch, the narratives don't fit, they break down, and then new coalitions form. And again, we're in a place right now where there's a lot of that happening. So I listened to the whole podcast, and I thought I want to do some commenting on this, because I think Tom Holland, as he continues to talk about this, I don't know what he's doing in terms of his book projects. I know he wants to write a book on the 60s and the counterculture, so I really hope he's working on that. I suspect he is, because I try to catch as many of the Tom Holland interviews as I can, partly, just like I've done with Jordan Peterson, to sort of watch the evolution in Tom as he develops his language, as he develops his speaking points. Of course, some of the illustrations and stories continue to carry through. That's what happens when you do repeated interviews. You find ways of saying things that you're comfortable with that seem to communicate. And so you keep listening so you keep repeating those. And if you're someone like me who isn't just listening to Tom Holland once, but you're trying to catch most of what he's saying, you sort of track its theme and variations. Okay, these are all the stories, but then you also pay close attention to, where's he putting this story? How's he tweaking this story? And again, as a minister and as a preacher, I pay close attention to these things because I do similar things. Pastors always have their hobby horses. Pastors always have their favorite illustrations in this, but it's fun watching this develop with other individuals. So I was originally going to do a commentary just on the last part of this podcast, but then I thought I should really listen to the front part, and I thought, no, the front part is important too, because the Anabaptist tradition reacts interestingly to all of the woke stuff. And you can hear that in Julian, because, Julian will have a real heart for they'll tend to be anti-capitalist, pacifist, social justice-y in terms of reiterating social justice, but not the kind of low-resolution, facile, I think, infantile utopianism that I see coming through some of the wokish. So let's dig into this whole podcast, and maybe I'll be able to do the whole thing in one sitting.
Welcome back to the Ploughcast.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Susanna Black, Senior Editor at Plough Quarterly.
And I'm Peter Momsen, Editor-in-Chief of Plough.
Phil Clay will be on to talk about...
And again, magazines are dead. Long live podcasts. This is, in some ways, how magazines are trying to adapt to the new media culture.
Afghanistan and the aftermath of our long sojourn there.
Paul Clay, all he's missing is a Vander in the middle.
And then Tom Holland, who is not yet a friend of the pod, but hopefully will be a friend of the pod, is going to be on to talk about empire, his book Dominion, and the difference that Christianity has made on empires. Okay, so welcome Phil Clay. Phil is
Phil Clay, sorry.
Friend of the pod, friend of the community, and the author of Missionaries and Redeployment. Missionaries is his first novel. Redeployment is a series of short stories. And he's also the host, along with, I believe, Jake Siegel of Manifesto, a podcast. Manifesto has an exclamation point in it, which you should definitely listen to.
So again, everybody's getting into podcasting because you sort of have to, so that we can have all this found time we're reclaiming when we're in the car. And now I want to make the comment, because I was at classes yesterday, and some people in my classes, I'm always a little surprised when people in my classes are actually listening to my videos or my podcast. A number of them didn't know that there was an audio-only version of this YouTube channel. There is, and the links are always below in the notes. And for about a third of, I know just by the metrics, about a third of you listen mostly via podcast. And so if you're looking at my hit numbers and trying to gauge how many people are listening to this, you have to add usually about a third to include the audio only audience. I'm
a big fan. And now let's get to it. Obviously, this was not your war. You were in Iraq.
By the time that I finally joined, I took, I accepted my commission in 2005. It was already clear that the war in Iraq wasn't going very well. So, I think that a lot of the veterans of my generation have a very different attitude toward these wars. I was talking with one friend, he was like, he was furious because he was working visas, right? Trying to get people out during the evacuation of in Kabul. And of course, veterans groups and advocacy groups had been saying that the Biden administration needed to put more priority on evacuation, that this was going to be a disaster. They've been saying that for months. I'd had meetings with folks where they talked about the sort of cold shoulder they were getting from the Biden administration. And then there they were in this sort of terrible situation, desperately trying to get people out in an incredibly chaotic environment. It was this sort of intensely...
So this part is just the news. It's going to pick up.
Emotional time, as after a long time of not paying attention, suddenly people were horrified by what was going on in Afghanistan. Though of course that that horror could have applied to many other pieces of the Afghan war, right? Just happening with less sort of intensity and less television drama. I went through northern Iraq in 2019, in December of 2019. And, it was very interesting because there were, I went through Sinjar where there'd been genocide of Yazidis, right?
Now, part of what sort of ties this together is, of course, Tom Holland was very interested in what was happened to the Yazidi people. It gets mentioned in his books. It comes up often in his interviews. So that's a tie between these two elements of this podcast. And like some of my videos, maybe the whole thing together doesn't tie that well, but bear with me on the first part of this interview with Phil Clay.
And, we went to a center for women who had been slaves under ISIS and then liberated. And, there are these little Yazidi kids of theirs are singing Baby Shark. And, we're in the midst of a society that has been through an unbearable cataclysm. And then we went to Mosul and we're going through the shattered old city, talking to people who had lived through the final days of the occupation. I met a man in a shattered house that the UN was rebuilding, the UNDP was rebuilding. And, he was talking about how he didn't send his kids to school because everything was violent, even math. He said it was always, bullet plus bullet equals 2 bullets, right? And towards the end.
Now, remember, the Plough is associated with Anabaptism. So pacifism is one of the defining values of Anabaptism. So, a comment like that would have a degree of resonance for the community following this publication.
And he said it was so horrible. They had no food to eat. They ate cats, they ate rats. It was hard to get water. You'd go down to the river to get water, but soldiers would shoot at you from the other side. And he was just there with his kids, feeling helpless because they're crying and there's nothing he can do for them. And at the same time, you're meeting with refugees from Syria who are furious that Trump pulled out some of the troops, right? Because Turkish-backed militias came in their wake and ethnically cleansed the area.
So now we're feeling some of the tensions between narratives. Trump pulled out the troops. How dare we pull out wait, we're pacifists. Wait, how do we pursue the good? We're living in an information age where we get if you want higher resolution images of what's going around the world, you can find them.
Of course. And the governor of Mosul is like talking about how American investors need to come and we need American support. I think he said it was a golden opportunity to invest in Mosul. I didn't leave thinking that we need to entirely pull back into our borders and be isolationists, right? And yet.
And even, let's say, America's history with isolationism, most famous between the First and the Second World War. How does that mesh with Anabaptism? Well, pacifists, on one hand, certainly don't want to send armies overseas. On the other hand, when you send your missionaries, aren't those sort of like cultural armies that you're sending? Because that's been the narrative among sort of the anti-colonialists. And so there's just so many cross pressures coming to bear in something like this.
The failures of the projects were so apparent.
How do you make that call? Like, how do you, if your response to the past 20 years is not isolationism, and if there's something deeply kind of problematic about the idea.
There's that word, problematic. Oh, buzzwords are holy words.
Of nation building, especially as you've described, it ends up half the time being nation smashing. How do you think about
nation building versus nation smashing? Now we have these long-term narratives of first there is sort of pristine purity and then there's degradation. That's deeply tied into, let's say, even the structure of the Bible. You start in a garden and then there's loss. Or is it a progressive narrative where sort of an evolutionary narrative where we're sort of developing, growing in goodness and morality? Those deep sort of meta narratives beneath the surface.
I guess America's role as a kind of imperial power.
Well, It's also,
And, again, if you listen to enough Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, America was in some ways the champion of anti-imperialism because we were a revolution. Now, we didn't come to the aid of the blacks as they were revolting against the French in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. So there's all these cross pressures. And then, of course, after the Second World War, when America sort of comes into its empire, and then you have decolonization in Africa. Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook talked about that in their podcast recently.
It's just we build castles in the air that we tell ourselves are real. I mean, that's what was clear with the government in Afghanistan, right? That we had constructed a government that never had any real legitimacy, right? We wanted to.
Okay, and what do we mean by legitimacy? I mean, it's natural in terms of a C.S. Lewis way. It's something that sort of goes on its own. It doesn't need it's not a client state. It doesn't need continual infusions of money and troops from the United States. You've got, again, echoes of the Vietnam War in here. You've got memories of Soviet Union clientism. And once basically the Soviet Union let East Germany know, we're not going to intervene, East Germany collapses. Cuba no longer gets its, being communist in the Western Hemisphere on America's doorstep money. You've got all of this stuff going on in terms of empires and colonies.
Really remake these societies from the ground up, and you can never do that, right? In the speech where Biden celebrated, perhaps is the word, announced the end of the war, he also promised that we were going to continue killing people in Afghanistan. It's a little peculiar for somebody to say that a war is ending and, oh, by the way, we're going to keep killing people there. That sounds like the war is continuing, it's just in a different form. Nation building might have been a failure. That doesn't mean that giving up on any concern with local political dynamics in countries where there are sort of threats to us is the answer, and instead we just kill people, right? Counterterrorism, right? Drone strikes, special operations raids.
So now you have this question. Well, and I listen very carefully, whether it's in churches or other places, when people say things like, it's our job to bring in the kingdom, when Christians say that. Oh, by what means will you bring in that kingdom? That's really the question. And of course, in the Anabaptist tradition, the means is, well, doing what Jesus did. This cruciform, self-sacrificial, communitarian, laying down our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And you can hear those themes in a lot of my preaching too. But what about the drone strikes? Is that how we bring in the kingdom? Well, that's sort of how the Romans brought in the kingdom, wasn't it? And the British Empire. The British Empire abolished slavery in the Muslim world via its colonial efforts. The British Empire ended the practice of widows falling upon the pyres of their dead husband in India. So things are getting complicated quickly.
Airstrikes, we kill people and then we leave. And, we don't have anybody on the ground to tell us, does that make things better?
What do you think it would have taken to get the American public shocked and horrified earlier?
Okay, so now what do we have? Well, this is the means. By what means do we bring in the eschaton? Well, we have to use the outrage economy to direct the public opinion to certain things. Remember the Maine, Spanish-American War. This is an old game. Or in the First World War, the rape of Belgium to get the British into the war and get the expeditionary force over the channel into France and Belgium to protect the Belgians. In a modern democracy, this is how you mobilize the nation to get something done. So what should we have done in Afghanistan and Iraq? We sort of, focus the nation, this great eye of Sauron that is the America media empire, focus them on a certain narrative in a certain way to direct them to a certain end. Now, part of the problem is social media, internet, that capacity is breaking down, and you almost can't focus that eye on something, whether it be vaccines or COVID or Russian videotapes or UFOs or climate change or Haitians that are coming through the Mexican border or without actually manifesting the opposition and the reaction to it. So if Biden is for one thing, Trump will be against it. And if Trump is for something, then Biden has to be against it. And if Biden isn't sufficiently against something that Trump did, well, we're going to have congressional hearings asking the Biden administration why they haven't, in one fell swoop, completely sort of inverted the nation against Donald Trump. And this is this low resolution thinking on all these terms. And so then you have all these things, right to life is about abortion and capital punishment. So you have then all these wedge issues that sort of highlight the fact that, well, this isn't, it isn't quite so simple. But no, we need to mobilize American outrage.
I think it's hard for people to get really invested in violence overseas, right? I mean, there's any number of reasons for it. Human beings were naturally most interested in our most immediate challenges, right? I mean, everybody is. But beyond that, it sort of disappeared as a political issue. So, if you remember the Bush administration, the war in Iraq, particularly, was a galvanizing political issue. And Barack Obama, who had criticized that war, sort of, was the preferred candidate of the, anti-war movement. Well, when he was elected, the anti-war movement sort of lost all of.
And this is, of course, how politics works in America. If you want to get elected, find how the potential outrage issues can line up to develop enough of a groundswell in order to achieve your goals. And of course, the California Republican Party failed to do this with COVID and Governor Newsom, but they had a pretty tough hill to climb in California to swing it. Arnold won, but Larry Elder didn't quite have the same panache Arnold did. That must be cultural racism in the Democratic Party, I suppose.
Its juice, but who would criticize that war, sort of, was the preferred candidate of the, anti-war movement. Well, when he was elected, the anti-war movement sort of lost all of its juice, but Obama was not an anti-war president, right? Mm-hmm. He So
now you get some of these tensions within Anabaptism. Well, we're pacifists, and so Bush started the Iraq War, a needless war with much cost and suffering. Obama is against it, but then, of course, Afghanistan is sort of the good war because of course, Osama bin Laden and 9/11, et cetera, et cetera.
You have a defensive American. He was elected. The anti-war movement sort of lost all of its juice, but Obama was not an anti-war president, right?
It lost its juice because it lost its outrage. Outrage is the juice by which we govern.
Mm-hmm. He gave a defensive American power around the world in his Nobel acceptance speech. He immediately, in his administration, began making legal arguments, expanding the scope of the executive's authority to kill people anywhere and everywhere. We're talking about as early as 2009. People are talking about a deterritorialized war, right? He did end the troop presence in Iraq, right? That was the war he had been against. But then when
even the framing of war is interesting because, for example, I read a book a number of years ago. I should probably reread it, on the Pax Romana. And it's like, oh, during Augustine's reign, there was peace. Well, there was fighting the whole time. Well, what are they fighting? They're just not, you just don't have someone like Carthage to size yourself up against. But your troops are always going out, and troops are always killing, and troops are always dying. And that's, back to the Vietnam War. It's a police action. You call it a police action, then you don't call it a war. And, well, can the U.S. do this? And, what can and can't the president do when the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war, et cetera, et cetera?
ISIS came back. He expanded it. He claimed that the war was over when, in fact, it wasn't. It was a talking point of the administration in 2015, right, where we were sending in special operators, right, who were sometimes getting into combat, right, but they were saying they're not boots on the ground technically, by which they meant we're not putting sort of large conventional forces on the ground in Iraq again. But we were increasingly, sending more people on the ground, special operators, even though for some reason they didn't count as boots on the ground. Maybe they were riding around on hoverboards. And, we were doing a lot of airstrikes, right, and drone strikes. And in that year, Susan Rice, I saw, I was at a talk event where Susan Rice was speaking to active duty military, 3-4-star generals were in the room, people from the NSC, about a dozen severely injured troops, right? Guys missing limbs, their faces severely burned. And she said, in the Obama administration, one of our proudest accomplishments is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And somebody went, right?
Although nation building abroad does not seem to have worked that well, the war did quite a lot to us as a nation. And one of the things that it did was, you've kind of described this George W. Bush and, Obama Democrat, Obama-style Democrat and probably Hillary Clinton-style Democrat too, consensus, you could call it like a neoliberal, neoconservative consensus or something like that, that we were just gonna do war. That was gonna be our thing. And that one of the things that did was it actually opened up a pretty strong, there was obviously the traditional lefty anti-war movement, but there was also this paleo-conservative movement that popped up. The American Conservative magazine.
Well, that's suddenly when I'm sort of in the American Conservative magazine. Well, where's that from? Well, that's Rod Dreher, and probably the only columnist at the American Conservative that I have read with any regularity over the last number of years. And American conservatives were by no means pro-Trumpers.
Started publishing in 2002. And one of its kind of like key issues, which it has been fairly consistent, although not entirely consistent, about was opposing American adventurism abroad. Now, obviously, you can criticize them for the reasons that they would oppose that, but
now here's where you have all these well, you can, and getting back to George Yancey's book and just looking at these dynamics back and forth. Well, we're with the Rod Dreher, and you can look at. For a while I was reading Damon Linker over at what's The Hill. On one, there was a generation that was changed by the second Gulf War, the second Iraq War. There's a generation that was changed by that war in terms of now suddenly, and of course Rod Dreher goes all the way over to the Orthodox. And in that way, you sort of have Peugeot and Dreher for different reasons and in different ways sort of marking the same path. Anabaptism, Catholic peace movement, the second Iraq War sort of broke something in Rod Dreher and in others. And, they were never going to be excited about Trump, but they weren't going to be anti-Trump like a lot of people on one side. And they're certainly not going to get down with Biden. So, but does that make them friends of the Anabaptist? Well, the Anabaptists are enormously cross-pressured in terms of their political frontage. So where all do we go with this?
That kind of has been fairly consistent, the anti-war movement. But there was also this paleo-conservative movement that popped up. The American Conservative magazine started publishing in 2002. And one of its kind of like key issues, which it has been fairly consistent, although not entirely consistent, about was opposing American adventurism abroad. Now, obviously, you can criticize them for the reasons that they would oppose that. But that kind of sort of paleocon pacifism has had, or not pacifism, but like anti-imperialism.
So how can we, okay, so how do the Anabaptists read Rod Dreher? Because in some ways, the Benedict option is a very Anabaptist move. Communitarian, the Anabaptists were in some ways, some of the neo-monastics of the Reformation. I mean, the Protestants, someone like John Calvin or Zwingli, John Calvin is going to make all of Geneva Christian. It's the kingdom coming to the city. The Anabaptists, well, they're not going to, well, after John of Leyden, no more playing around with making a purely Anabaptist city. We're not going to dabble in politics like that anymore. We are going to be a pure community apart. But you almost, again, back to the speeds in the Protestant Reformation, if for John Calvin the city was the second speed and the church was the first speed, for the Anabaptists, they kind of wanted to have one speed, and if we would only be good enough Christians, we could get rid of all this government and policing and war and all of that. Okay, so there's sort of that dream out there, and I know for you Anabaptists who are listening, you're going to say, "No, you're straw manning us," and that's not my intent to straw man. It's much more to, and I'll try to be critical of my own tradition as well, because John Calvin wanted to make Geneva a holy city. And in the Christian Reformed Church, it's always an ongoing joke. If in the Christian Reformed Church you mention the holy city, you mean Grand Rapids, Michigan, with Zondervans and Erdmans and Baker. Because, of course, book writing is sort of the height of the rationalistic Reformation. Of course, that deeply connects to the broader American neo-evangelicalism of Christianity today and the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which has become their, it's a much more popular podcast than Quick to Listen. So all of these things are working through here.
Has had a pretty profound effect, I think, on our political culture, and it opposed that. But that kind of sort of paleocon pacifism has had, or not pacifism, but like anti-imperialism, has had a pretty profound effect, I think, on our political culture. And in a way, I don't think that you'd have Donald Trump without that. Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's anti-imperialism. I think it really is imperialist certainly in the Trumpist form, but willing to call the Iraq War a disaster.
Okay, so now where are some of the pressures behind? So if you're sort of over on the left, you're gonna feel a lot of pressure to say bad things about Trump. Is Trump a nationalist or an internationalist? Well, how do those differentiations go? I'll continue to stand behind Christian nationalism versus Christian imperialism. But suddenly, okay, how about all the race stuff? Well, Trump is a racist, and we're going to have to emphasize that. So race is going to come into it, and it is going to come into it right now with the story that he tells.
Before the election of Donald Trump, I was at a wedding, a buddy of mine from the Corps in rural Pennsylvania, right? And as we're driving in, my wife's Colombian American, and we passed like the 19th, Trump digs coal sign. And she's like, "Am I going to be the only Hispanic person at this wedding?" And I was like, no, it's military wedding. Like, it's going to be super diverse.
Okay, now the military is super diverse. And this has been true for a long time because many of Sacramento was a very military town. You had the Army Depot, you had Mather Air Force Base, you had McClellan Air Force Base. So during the Vietnam War, my neighborhood in Sacramento was built about in 1960 and beyond. A lot of Vietnam War vets, a lot of people who had served in the military came out to California, part of the military, very diverse military, a place where, especially coming out of Jim Crow and into the 60s and 70s, if you're African American, you can get into the military and you can have a legitimate, decent career, and you can retire from the military. With the military, you can travel the world. There are people in this church who were overseas and in Europe because they went there with the military. And so the military has been in American culture over the last 50 years, an avenue for advancement for African Americans, as has, part of the reason, if you read the 2003 Time magazine article about the neighborhood where I minister as the most integrated, Sacramento is the most integrated city in America, it's because a lot of those government jobs pushed integration. And so redlining, went out in the 1960s. African Americans could buy suburban tract homes. African Americans could have good state jobs. And that's been true here for a long time. And so, the military, this is a military wedding. It's going to be ethnically diverse, but wait a minute, I thought racial reconciliation is all about progressives and conservatives are racists, and all of these things break down.
But we passed like the 19th, Trump digs coal sign, and she's like, "Am I going to be the only Hispanic person at this wedding?" And I was like, "No, it's military wedding, like it's going to be super diverse," which it was, but. I get there and I meet the other groomsmen and I text my wife. I'm like, not only are you not the only Hispanic person at this wedding, you're not even going to be the only Colombian American there. And she's like, really? And I was like, yeah. And he already early voted for Trump. Now, when I asked him why.
Wait a minute. Hispanic immigrant voted early for Trump? Oh, there's lots of cross pressures blowing in the wind here.
He gave a fairly straightforward answer. He's like, you and me were both Marines, right? He's like, we both know guys who've been killed in these wars. We both know guys who've been blown up in these wars. We both know guys, who've lost limbs or whatever in these wars. And what do we have to show for it? Just horror overseas, right? And who are the two candidates? Well, one's Donald Trump. Does he know much about the military? No. Did he say for like a hot second in 2003 that he was on like a radio show that he was for the war? Yeah. But he was almost immediately saying that we should declare victory and go home. He's sort of had this kind of isolationist streak for decades. And at the very least, I don't think he's going to expand the wars, right? And I think he's going to want to pull back. On the other side, who do we have? Hillary Clinton. She's a liberal hawk, right? Her lesson from Libya was that we should have been more involved. And, she's got a general who wants to expand our footprint in Syria at the speaking.
So what you have here is a fairly high resolution picture of this individual, this Colombian American's individual choice, Marine veteran, about who to elect based on all of these issues of imperialism, nation building, American empire issues. How do you make that selection?
At the DNC, right? Is she competent? Yes. She's going to competently expand America's wars overseas and get us into greater disasters that will cause untold suffering. So I'm going to vote for Trump. Or I already voted for Trump. You understand the deep distrust of, foreign policy elites who even as the Afghan government was just like dissolving, right? We're saying, it would have been sustainable if we just kept a couple of thousand troops in the field, it would have been like Germany or Korea, the least plausible analogy ever.
Kabul as the new Stuttgart.
Being encircled by Swabian reactionary rebels, forcing everybody to like shut down their beer halls and wear lederhosen. But then we, deployed a few thousand troops, and they all switched to making like, house music instead. Like, that didn't happen. That is a dumb analogy. Like, and people kept making it because it was all they had,
Mm-hmm.
It was crazy.
I mean, this is sort of an obvious thing to say, but one of the upshots, I think, of both what you've said and what you've written is that you can't make a polity from the outside in.
You can.
Here's the dilemma of bringing in God's kingdom. Where is the kingdom located? Is it in the externalities? Is it in the inside? Is it the heart that gets expressed out? Or is it all of the materiality that then forms the heart? It comes right down to so many of these questions about human essence and what human beings are.
Influence it. I mean, I do very much believe in soft power, right? There's a lot that we can do to influence other societies. We just can't dictate terms to them. We can't reshape them in our image, right? That was always doomed to failure.
Now it's interesting though, because, well, maybe if you're keeping the Christian gloves on, because, well, past empires have reshaped the world, just continue to have generations of absolute brutality and propaganda. But the American way has been, well, soft propaganda. Let's mold them with our media. And that's how we'll change them. And then there's sort of the new atheist obviousness of their regime. Well, goodness and rightness, well, that's just obvious. Oh my, how naive are we? That you don't imagine that someone might have a different opinion of what might be good and how to get there.
I kind of feel like that might be a good place to stop, Phil. That was fantastic.
Thank you. This is perfect.
This is really extremely perfect.
Music.
Welcome to Tom Holland.
That was perfect. That was perfect. How is that going to cross over into this? Now, again, this is where I was going to start playing, and I think now I was the second place I was going to start playing where they mentioned the American conservative and that, but the first gives a degree of credibility and lets us know a little bit who this guy is, who obviously has been on the podcast before, and I haven't listened to any other episodes of the podcast before, but so now we're into Tom Holland. And again, I think this is, I've listened to a lot of Tom Holland, and this is one of the better, his better interviews. Maybe I'll pause it here.
Who we're very pleased to have on as a guest on our podcast. He is himself a caster of pod. With Dominic Sandbrook, he has a podcast called The Rest is History, of which I'm a big fan. Huge fan. Shush.
Oh, you're too kind.
He's the historian of...
Hey, is there a bigger fan of Tom Holland than me? Come on, let's have a hierarchy here.
Various empires. He's the author of Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, Persian Fire, his history of the Greco-Persian Wars, and I think 9 other books, if I'm right about that. Most recently, he's the author of Dominion. He's also an elite sportsman, an expert tweeter, and not the star of the new Spider-Man movie. I knew you first as the author of Dominion, a book about, the subtitle is, I think, The Making of the West.
It has different titles in Britain and America, which kind of highlights the cultural differences that the Atlantic separates. So in Britain, it's The Making of the Western Mind, because my editor didn't want to have any hint of Christianity on the cover in case it would put off the book buying public. Whereas in America, it was, what was it? I can't remember. It's some...
How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Are you talking to Anabaptists? Again, I'm not 100% sure. That's been my assumption. You get this intuitions. I used to play games if I was on vacation and I'd visit a church. You'd go into a church that had absolutely zero denominational marker, and then you walk in the lobby and just look around. What publications are here? How are they? And it got really hard with the seeker churches because they really scrubbed things. But not Rick Warren's Southern Baptist. He really is. And these are Anabaptists playing the seeker game. I mean, it just sort of made it so much fun. But how the Christian Revolution remade the world. So what's the connection between the first part and the second part? No, this is not a signed copy. This is a signed copy by Rob, because I once made a request I didn't have a hard copy of Dominion, and so this listener sent me this copy, for which I'm grateful. But if I ever get to the UK and if I get to the UK, I'm going to try and meet Tom Holland in person. And if I ever do that, I am definitely going to buy I'm probably going to try and buy a copy of Dominion in a bookshop, because they have them there, I'm told, and only the better bookshops. And then I will definitely have him sign it, because I am a big fan, and I know he's embarrassed by my fandom at some point, but that's just his cross to bear. So, is Christian Revolutions? Oh, and that gets again into the video I made about Peugeot. Christianity is not revolutionary. Anabaptists, Julian the Hutterite, Christianity is revolutionary. Then at a meetup here in Sacramento, one person basically laid it right out and said, well, you've got the Peugeot versus Tom Holland, because Tom Holland says Christianity is a revolution and Peugeot says it isn't. And right there I thought, wow, I hadn't put that together yet. That's the fun of living in a world with other minds.
Something like Why Christianity is Brilliant or something. It's The Making of the Western Mind, because my editor didn't want to have any hint of Christianity on the cover in case it would put off the book buying public. Whereas in America, it was, what was it? I can't remember. It's something like Why Christianity is Brilliant or something
Revolutions.
like that. And there's the Dali crucifix. It's How the Christian Revolution Changed the World is the American subtitle, which I think is actually a much more accurate description.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody picked up that book hoping to not find any trace of Christianity, they would be sadly disappointed.
Yes.
I wanted to talk with you because you're not a Christian. You're sort of interestingly Christian adjacent. And I think what was striking to me about Dominion was that it seemed as though you were writing, it starts, I think in around 500 BCE.
Yeah, it starts in 479 BC, which is in the aftermath of the Persian invasion of Greece in 480. And the reason that it starts there is that Persia is the first empire that effectively moralizes its own imperialism. So it sees the world in terms of good and evil, of light and darkness, and that obviously is a huge influence on Christianity and indeed Islam. And there's a kind of tendency in the West to see ourselves as the heirs of Greece and of Athens, but I think we're at least as much the heirs of Persia. That's fascinating. So, I mean, I've heard Zoroastrianism being... And
again, the rest is history, just recently did a 2-part episode on Thermopylae and Salamis, and I thought the end of the second half of the second podcast, I thought I could do some commentary on this, because it's absolutely brilliant stuff. I think it's really, really good. Spoken of as an influence on Christianity as well. Well, it's very, very complicated, because it's not actually what we would call Zoroastrianism under the First Persian Empire. I mean, it's a kind of proto-Zoroastrianism,
but a lot of the themes that will become part of what are institutionalized several centuries later as Zoroastrianism are there. And there's no question that the Persian kings, when they invade Greece, which is this kind of mountainous backwater full of terrorists, basically, that the Persians are going in there to basically to sort it out, to bring order and stability and peace there as they see it. And of course, it all goes disastrously wrong. And we're recording this in the aftermath of the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think that there's a sense in which America has been riffing on that very, very ancient Persian theme, and the idea that simply because America is a democracy and because Athens was a democracy, therefore there's a kind of a straight line of descent from the two, is very much complicated by the fact that actually it's Persia that provides the model for Christian and Islamic imperialism.
Yeah, we would like to see ourselves as kind of, pre-Rubicon Rome, or as something like Athens, but...
Yeah, very, very, very different.
There's such a distinctive flavor to the book. It reminds me a little bit of Hilaire Belloc's history writing, but you end up writing about Christianity and eventually Judaism first, obviously, and then Christianity. But you're very clearly, it seems to me, right, like if you were a character in this book, you would not be one of the Jews or one of the Christians. You are sort of speaking as one of the...
Well, no, I'm not sure that's true, because actually I am a character in the book. Right at the end, I include myself as a character, and
now the friend of mine who sent me this podcast saying, "Oh, here's a Tom Holland podcast," who said, "Oh, young people aren't leaving Christianity," and when she sent that to me, and I'm going to make sure I let her know that I did a video on this and that I mentioned her, and she knows who she was. She was actually at the classes meeting yesterday. But you have to understand Tom Holland's definitions here. And this is, at this point, it's very interesting because certain elements of Anabaptism got deeply into the American assumptions about who is and who isn't a Christian. Now, I bumped into this, you bump into this recently because some of the magisterial Protestants are a little bit different on this. Because, of course, for Calvin, the city is Christian, but the church is basically the fast speed, the intensification of what is nominal in the city. And that's sort of, the monastery is the intensification of what's nominal in the church and then what's nominal in the kingdom. And so you have all of these different speeds of intensification. And so, for example, at my classis meeting, well, someone who is a Christian it came up in my comment section recently. It wasn't in my comment section, but somebody, it was in my comment section. Well, going to church doesn't make you a Christian. Well, what does? And, the definition that I often throw out, a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. Well, where's the church in that? Well, where is the church in that? And what is the role of the church? And, well, now we're into a whole bunch of things.
Well, I described my mother, but particularly my godmother, who was, for me, a kind of a great inspiration, a model, really, of how to live. And she was a very devout Christian. And I suppose the final chapter is an acknowledgement that, it's ridiculous to imagine that I can stand outside, because the central claim of the book is that the West is just completely Christian, that you don't have to go to church.
It's completely Christian. Has the kingdom come? I mean, even just the phrasing of, and I'm not trying to straw man Tom Holland here at all. I'm his biggest fan. But okay, what do we mean by that? And what does Tom mean by that?
Church will believe in God to be shaped by it so profoundly as in effect to be Christian. So to that extent, I would say I'm absolutely Christian, because I think it's impossible
And Sam Harris is too.
to be in the West and not to be shaped and influenced by it. I mean, the question of whether I think that, you know, Jesus rose from the dead is a different matter. I would like to, and there are times, you know, if I get,
I think he, if he'd finished his sentence, something that I never do, I always finish my sentences. I'd like to believe Jesus rose from the dead. Believing Jesus rose from the dead is in some ways, you have to be the heir of some privilege in terms of something that is personally unearned but bestowed to you from your parents, enforced by all sorts of tyrannical church going through your young years, or some converts manage to believe without having to go through that. So what is a Christian? What are these terms that we're using?
go to maybe at Christmas or Easter, if I'm in a place where, you know, where those thin places that people talk about, where the divine seems very close, that I can believe it. And there are other times where it just seems complete nonsense to me. But
I love his honesty. It is, as a pastor, it is so refreshing. Don't BS me about this stuff, please. I have my own consciousness, Congress. I understand doubt. Trust me. I'm not saying Tom Holland is BSing. I'm saying there's a lot of BSing that goes on in church.
But whether I'm in my skeptical or in my believing mode of thought, I never doubt that in my core assumptions I'm Christian through and through, and that's really what the argument of the book is about.
Can you talk about how that kind of, how those core assumptions...
Now, when you get into Anabaptism, because, now again, someone might leave a comment and say, the Ploughcasts aren't Anabaptists. Okay, fine. But I am, for the sake of this video, contrasting them with Anabaptists, because Anabaptism, well, who is a Christian? Not so much someone, and this gets into all of these conversations in the Vervaeke space too, not someone who holds propositional assent, and in the Peterson space, someone holds propositional assent. A Christian is someone who acts kindly, does justice, and walks humbly with their God by, you know, feeding the poor. So that's that sort of physical reiteration of the descriptions that we find in Jesus in the New Testament. There's the Anabaptist way. The other Protestant way is very much cognitive assent, confessionalism, this kind of thing. It's the mental cognition and the do you or don't you believe in the resurrection? Well, that sounds like a very abstract thing. How does it get played out? Well, maybe if you have to put your life on the line for something, and you can do so because you say, well, I believe in the resurrection, and so I can put my life on the line responsibly because of this. Well, are you really believing in the resurrection, or are you just moved at that moment because you're in one of these places where the world is thin, where the boundaries are thin? This is good stuff.
differ from, say, the core assumptions of... let's talk about Rome, for example. So obviously Rome features heavily in the book. What is the impact of Christianity on the Roman mind, I guess, or on the Roman Empire?
Well, I mean, let's look at the core symbol of Christianity, which is the cross. And the cross had an important significance in the Roman imagination as well, as an emblem of their power and their authority to inflict torture on those who opposed them.
Now, if you've been following my sermon last week, I mean, I took whole chunks of dominion into my sermon last week.
And those who oppose them might be rebels in the provinces, or they might be slaves. And there's
and again, this is right in the Anabaptist wheelhouse. Yes, tell me more.
Sense in which the distinction between those two categories become blurred, because to suffer on the cross for the Romans is the worst possible death. And it's the most humiliating. It's the most agonizing. It's not just that you suffer for hours, perhaps days, but that you do it in public. And so people can gather and watch as birds peck out your eyes or attack your genitals. They can laugh at you as you struggle to continue breathing. And the humiliating character of the death is precisely what then serves to affirm the dignity of Rome as an imperial power and the master as someone who can inflict this suffering on the slave. Christianity obviously radically reconfigures that. And the idea that the cross can serve as an emblem of the triumph of the slave over the master.
This is the deconstruction of karma.
Or the victim over the victimizer, or indeed the provincial over the imperialist, is so destabilizing that it's hard to put into words just how profound a cultural upheaval it represents.
You've talked about, I mean, obviously the title of the book is Dominion, the lordship. What is the...
Now we have Anabaptist cross-pressers. Dominion? No, if we just form the community and live out the communitarian, cruciform, sacrificial, then the kingdom comes and is in our midst. And, this tradition wouldn't continue to be as vigorous and as vital as it is now if, of course, there weren't truth to that.
I guess a way to ask this would be, it seems to me throughout the book that you're kind of talking about the West, or the aspects of the West that are influenced by Christianity, which you might call like the remnants of Christendom, or like the unshakable sort of structural and deep-seated assumptions of Christendom, are a kind of empire of the mind, that although they're not a political empire, there is a kind of like almost an invisible empire, which I would say sort of corresponds to something like what Christians think of as the kingdom of God, that's been kind of permeating through the West over the course of Christianity's rise. Is that sort of what you were getting at with that title and through the book?
Well, the title.
Now, at some point, that's not it. Today, I knew I had a couple hours to make a video, and it was either going to be comment on this podcast, which I found first, or comment on this video that a number of you have sent my way, Wokeism and Our Transhuman Future, which I thought was really a very important video. And so we will get there. But when she talks about the change of the mind, this video is sort of the so Rick and I are always talking about how we make videos. So Rick's like, you need to have your window smaller and more because you want to see my beautiful face, at least those of you watching the video. And again, at least 1/3 of you are just listening to the audio, and so you don't get the opportunity to see my beautiful face. But this video just has basically image after image after image with the monologue in the background. That's that style of video. But some of the points that he makes about the development of wokeism in Western philosophy and religion is really rather good. So I do very much want to make a commentary on that. Anyway, back to, lest I distract myself. Oops, where are we? Here we are. Back to this.
Title points, the whole of Christianity is paradox.
Creating through the West over the course of Christianity's rise. Is that sort of what you were getting at with that title and through the book?
Well, the title points, the whole of Christianity is paradox. At its heart, it's rooted in paradox, that God can become man, that death can become life. Everything about it is paradoxical. But in historical terms, the paradox is that a faith that puts at its heart, the first shall be last, the last shall be first, of which the story of Exodus, of the slaves being the favourites of God, or of course the crucifixion and the resurrection, that in the cross becomes the emblem of triumph over worldly empire. That this faith in itself ends up becoming the most globally hegemonic way of explaining what humanity is here for. And there is obviously an incredible tension there between the power that Christianity has come to exert and the kind of nagging sense that actually it's in powerlessness that God's favourites are to be found. And that has been...
In other words, it's karma says it's in success and wealth and power and dominion that God or the gods reveals their favorite. And of course, Christianity inverts that. No, it's the preferential option for the poor, so says liberation theology. This is how God is revealed in losing. But yet now suddenly, if you're like some parts of, let's say, Kuyperian Christian reformdom, where it's our job to bring in the kingdom, well, is it karma or not? And, I was mentioning to my colleague that in some places in the Christian Reformed Church, you have, let's say, two overlapping classes geographically. You can sort of divide the tensions, and you can sort of have the progressive wing of the CRC, which isn't that progressive, and then the conservative wing of the CRC. But in my particular classes, we don't have two classes. So we have churches from the San Francisco Bay Area, which want to sort of emphasize the preferential option to the poor in the most powerful, culturally powerful state in the world, in Silicon Valley, which is expressing its dominion over us day in and day out, the churches of which are, of course, one way or another probably benefiting from the wealth that is flowing into the San Francisco Bay. So there you have that paradox right there. But those churches, Christian Reformed churches in the Bay Area are withering away. And then you have the Valley churches in our classes, churches in places like Ripon, California. People will have to pull out Google Maps and find Ripon, California, which is the epicenter of Northern California Christian reformdom, where the churches are thriving in a conservative, Trumpish way, which then sets up the Christian Reformed culture war. And, yesterday with two classical examinations, both of which, well, one of the guys had been a pastor for 20 years here in Sacramento with me, one of my colleagues, both guys colleagues, because Sacramento is right here at the divide where we're purple. We're not blue like the Bay, but we're not red like Ripon. We're right there in the middle. And so, well, what happens is God being manifest by the dominion of those who tout the poor? These inversions just twist around and around and around and around. And, well, revolution is around and around and around and around. So are we talking revolution, or are we talking kind of a Pageauian way of having a hierarchy in which Jesus fills the hierarchy? I mean, that's sort of how Pageau, in a static sense, tries to get at the movement sense of revolution.
An issue and the kind of nagging sense that actually it's in powerlessness that God's favourites are to be found. And that has been an issue really right from the very beginning. So if Christianity claims that its message is for the entire world. So famously, that's articulated by Paul in his letter to Galatians.
And we sing, Jesus shall reign where'er the sun. And the followers of Abraham Kuyper love to trot out that quote, "There's not one square inch over his creation about which Jesus Christ does not claim, 'This is mine.'" So the president, the now departing president of Calvin University's newsletter was, was it square inch or square foot? I don't remember. It's read it for a while, but someone who was himself not a product of the Christian Reformed Church. So all of these tensions and right now in my denomination, in my little place in the world, all of these tensions are coming to bear. And in many ways, they all come to bear inside of me because, of course, I was raised during the civil rights movement in a racial reconciliation church in a place that the New York metropolitan area has not gentrified, because what's the point? Even though Alexander Hamilton himself, and there's a statue of Alexander Hamilton overlooking the Passaic Falls, which Tom Holland posts a picture of him and his wife and daughter, I suppose, going out to look at the Sopranos movie. If you actually watch the Sopranos, they visit the Passaic Falls. And they're an impressive falls, but when you leave viewing the falls, as I did as a child, you walk away and kind of have to take a shower because all of the pollutants put into the Passaic River in the 20th century. It should be an absolutely beautiful river, but all of the dioxins and all of the pollutants that fueled American industry and American success, it's just all seeped into my bones. And I'm caught right in the middle of these paradoxes, and in some ways, this is exactly what energizes my channel, and frustrates many of you, even those of you who watch all of my videos, and I hear your angst and frustration. Well, why can't Paul finally what? Agree with you? It's my torment, but I see it writ large.
That there is no Jew or Greek, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free in Christ. As Paul himself discovers, there are those who reject this idea that all cultural difference, for instance, can be dissolved into a single identity, because most Jews don't accept Paul's message. So right from the very beginning, Paul and his followers have to wrestle with the issue of, well, what do you do with people who reject this message of a kind of universal Christian identity?
Ran a homeless guy to the hospital on Monday night, and I figured he'd be in there for a few weeks. That's been the pattern lately, but he just knocked on my door. Monday night we get halfway to the hospital, and he looks over at me and he says, "I left an envelope in my shopping cart with some money in it." It's like, I don't want to turn around. "How much money?" "Oh, maybe $10. So I'm thinking, $10. I mean, to go through his shopping cart, this is a pretty severe alcoholic who the shopping cart is mostly filled with rotten food, alcohol, bedding, any paperwork that he has, some meds, and maybe some money. And so I thought, I gotta get to go through his shopping cart and look for this envelope. And, and my meds. Okay, and your meds. So I said, okay, well, I'll go back and go through your shopping cart and look for your money. Well, how much money? Maybe $10, maybe $100. Okay, that won't last long. So go back, get back here. Have to go all the way through the shopping cart. Just brought it over the garbage can, threw away the rotten food, threw away the stuff that was obvious. I kept the other stuff, the bedding, which reeks of urine. Kept that in the shopping cart, because last time he went into the hospital, I figured he'd be in there for 3 weeks, and I threw out a bunch of his stuff, and 5 hours later he's knocking on my door again. "Where's my stuff?" "Oh, it's in the garbage can. They haven't come yet." So got it out of the garbage can. So I came back here, went through his shopping cart, found the envelope with money in it, $1. I also found found his prescription meds, so got those out of the shopping cart and threw away the rotten food and pushed the shopping cart over into a out-of-the-way place on the property here. And So then he just knocked on my door. Is my shopping cart here? This morning I got in and it was gone. Someone took care of it, whatever, but I still had his meds and his envelope with $1 in it. So now he's going to go to the bank and get another sleeping bag, and the whole thing starts all over again. Anyway, what were we talking about?
And I think it's, perhaps for that reason, it's Christianity's relationship with the Jews that is the most notorious example of what can rise from the insistence of Christians that there is a kind of universal identity. Because for those who reject it, what does that mean? It doesn't always mean good things. So
now, I just watched a video that someone had. Well, I'll pull it up. That's the beauty of this. And I guess, I talked about the American Conservative and Rod Dreher. Part of why I started a YouTube channel was I wanted to do something similar to what I saw Dreher doing in his blog. But I thought it's got to be able, you can just link YouTubes, but the truth is, and I'm doing a Substack now, I can link YouTubes, but reading and listening to podcasts are really two different media. So what I can do now, and it's part of the reason I set up the way I do these, is so that if I get an idea, I can just pop right into something else.
It's because I do not have settled. This video is more like a stray thought.
That video, I have a whole channel like this.
Because I do not have settled conclusions on the problem I'm about to discuss yet. But I have been musing of late on the asymmetry between moral particularism and moral universalism.
So you'll hear Tom Holland talk about universalism a lot. And, part of his argument is that this comes from Persia, not simply from the Jews. Now, it's especially important to remember, just chronologically, that when you meet Jesus in Second Temple Judaism, the Second Temple is rebuilt with the mandate and assistance of the Persians. That the Persians were sort of managing this polytheistic universalism in a rather special way that deeply impacted the Judaism. Isn't that anachronism? That deeply impacts what we find in the New Testament.
I am about to share with you some quotations from some ancient religious texts which demonstrate the issue quite well. Now, for the purposes of this video, it doesn't matter where these quotations are from, so I have substituted specific terms here with Carl Schmitt's terms friend and enemy, which will still illustrate the basic problem. So let us begin the quotations.
Apparently Adam and Sitch used this on their Sunday 12-hour live stream. I'm a little busy on Sunday. Sorry, Adam.
Only friends are human. Enemies are animals. For murder, whether of an enemy by an enemy or of a friend by an enemy, punishment is incurred, but of an enemy by a friend there is no death penalty. Even the best of the enemies should be killed. If a friend is tempted to do evil, he should go to a city where he is not known and do the evil there. Enemy's flesh is as the flesh of asses, and whose issue is like the issue of horses. If an enemy hits a friend, the enemy must be killed. Hitting a friend is hitting God. If an ox of a friend gores an ox of an enemy, there is no liability. But if an ox of an enemy gores an ox of a friend, the payment is to be in full. If a friend finds an object lost by an enemy, it does not have to be returned. God will not spare a friend who marries his daughter to an old man, or takes a wife for his infant son, or returns a lost article to an enemy.
Now right away you can get a real sense of the kind of universalism that Tom Holland is talking here, in the way that with Jesus, this universalism gets seeded, and with Paul it comes to fruition, and there's a deep anxiety in the Jewish community. And, I've been talking about this in my sermons, because if you imagine, how on earth are these Jews living in diaspora Rome, in Thessalonica, in Rome, in Corinth, in Antioch, in Caesarea, in Alexandria? How on earth are they supposed to keep their identity if they don't simply always compare and contrast and walk that line? I talked about that last week in Acts 17, and Paul in Thessalonica, where the Jews had to, this is around the time of the Jewish expulsion by Claudius from Rome. They were probably tremendously nervous about this tripwire. And so, sort of like the Christian Reformed Church during the First World War, where Americans don't know the difference between Dutch and Deutsch, that you find Christian Reformed churches all around the United States festooned with American flags. And at this point in Christian Reformed history, they switch from Dutch to English. But this universalism that happens under Christ is just transformative. And you can find it seeded in some ways. You sort of have one speed and two speed in the book of Exodus, where the Lord tells you are you are my priests, you are a nation of priests. Well, then you're the intense speed, and the world is the second speed. That's implicit. But of course that comes then to Jesus, where you have in the Gospel of Luke a Roman centurion, surely this is the Son of God, and the work of Paul. So, this stuff is all going throughout.
Whether it's Jews or a kind of universal Christian identity. And I think it's, perhaps for that reason, it's Christianity's relationship with the Jews that is the most notorious example of what can rise from the insistence of Christians that there is a kind of universal identity. Because for those who reject it, what does that mean? It doesn't always mean good things. So whether it's Jews or whether it's the people who come to be described by Christians as pagans, and the idea of a pagan is an entirely Christian one.
There you have it. The idea of a pagan is an entirely Christian one. It's paganos. It's the people, the urban people are Christians. Now we've got Central California, where the the Christian Reformed churches in the ag communities, well, they're doing pretty well. The Christian Reformed churches in the world-class cities, like where I grew up in, just outside of New York City, those Christian Reformed churches are struggling and they're all sort of just relying on whatever power is left in the Dutch colonial thing, even though they've changed all of their language. And, my father's church is a racial reconciliation church, sort of a frontier place by where the Dutch Calvinists and the African Americans could find and meet and become one in this thing called the church. But, Tom Holland just sort of universalized the church. I don't.
Or Muslims in due course, or, as various kind of notions within Christianity evolve as to what being Christian should be, the idea of heretics, Catholics, Protestants, whatever. So that remains a kind of enduring tension. And I think that we see in Western countries at the moment, and perhaps most convulsively actually in the United States, an anxiety about Christianity's power that exists entirely within a Christian context. So there's an awful lot of what's been going on, I think, since the 60s, which I would see as a kind of convulsion.
So a lot of the stuff that he said, you can find Tom Holland saying a lot. Now we start to get, I think, into things that are a little bit more refined.
Of parallel to the Reformation. The 60s is up there with the with the 1520s as a period where deeply Christian assumptions get recalibrated. That Christianity has been rejected by increasing numbers of people within American society, but for deeply Christian reasons. It's
And there you get Tom Holland's paradox. Christianity is rejected. So there's the answer to you, my friend, who sent me this podcast, for which I'm grateful. Christianity is rejected by Christians for Christian reasons. That's in some ways Sam Harris. Christianity is rejected by Christian Sam Harris for Sam Harris's Christian regions. And when Jordan Peterson, he's up on stage with Jordan Peterson to debate this, you have all of these conflicts in there. And just watch the rest of history on culture war.
Rejected because it's identified with power and with authority, with the man. But it's rejected for reasons that make no sense outside of a cultural Christian matrix.
We actually have an article in the issue of Plough that this podcast is associated with by the former president of one of the premier leadership bodies of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in this country. Russell Moore is his name, about why young people are leaving the church. And there's a recent polling over the last 5 years show, plummeting identification with white Protestantism by younger cohorts. And he's of course has been much hand-wringing in Christian circles about why that is the case, why there's plummeting levels of identification both as Christians and as church-going Christians. I'd be curious. You've in a way answered that, but what would you say to a church leader in the United States? Why are young people leaving Christianity? Are we on the way to becoming the next Sweden in 30 years?
Well, I don't think they are leaving Christianity. I think they're leaving Christianity in the way that Protestants left the Roman Church in the 1520s. I think that they are, a new Christian identity is emerging and evolving. And obviously, for those who, in a sense, are defending the status quo, that's an incredibly traumatic and unsettling experience. But I mean, I would say that it's deeply rooted. So, I mean, it seems to me that as an outsider, that the current convulsions in the United States are deeply rooted in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and in fact in the need for that civil rights movement, because that was an impeccably Christian movement. It's the Reverend Martin Luther King, because what King was doing,
Junior, his father was senior. It's just a little pedantic correction by someone who's can be a little nerdy.
Was essentially summoning white Protestants and indeed, white Christians generally to a recognition of biblical truth that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. That if there is no Jew or Greek, then there's certainly no black or white. And it was the fact that it was because white Christians could recognize the truth of that, the impact of that the civil rights movement proved as successful as it did. But what happened then in the 60s was that various other groups of people within American society that felt themselves to be disadvantaged drew on that campaign. So women, so the feminist movement, it was kick-started by this, gay rights. And the problem for Christians, of course, was that whereas the argument that, that there's no black or white absolutely goes with the grain of Christian thinking over 2,000 years, the notion that, there's no man or woman in Christ, but there should be no man or woman kind of in society generally was more challenging, because that hadn't always been a part of Orthodox Christian teaching.
In fact, there are elements of Orthodox Christian teaching that very much go against that idea, which another one of the videos I want to do is a little response to a Rationality Rules video.
And, of course, gay rights was even more problematic. And so essentially what happened over the 70s, 80s into the 90s was that a kind of no man's land began to open up between doctrinally professing Christians and groups like gay rights campaigners, feminists.
Which, again, are Tom is basically saying, are deeply Christian. But if you say that they're Christian, well, wait, Christianity, that's part of the patriarchy. And so then suddenly you have, maybe some themes that some of you are worried I'm going to abandon about the mega churches and Mark Driscoll and confession Christians versus cultural Christians, and which speed Christians, because suddenly people who are activists out there marching are now, in a sense, the new church, but there is no church. Is Black Lives Matter a church? Do they replace the church? Do you have more? Does someone who is a part of Black Lives Matter, of course they took down, the deconstruction of the nuclear family. Yeah, now they got to play politics. So there's a lot going on.
I guess people on the kind of liberal left who came to see themselves as essentially emancipating themselves from Christianity. And so the more hostile professing Christians became to liberals, the more liberals came to see themselves as not being Christian, and vice versa. And so, the trenches deepened, the barbed wire became more and more entangled, the no man's land became harder and harder to traverse. And that's basically the situation that the United States is in at the moment.
Now, the problem with a lot of my videos is I can't choose which video I really want to comment on. So maybe just a little tidbit of this video.
The Aristotelian view of things, this hylomorphic perspective, where we are composite beings, so far from being an external instrument, the body is part of our personal reality, and while it can't exist apart from the soul, it's not inferior. The idea of the soul in Orthodox Christianity would be the substantial form rather than the ghost in the machine. You can separate the body from the soul in analysis, but not in fact. There's this idea of the body-soul composite. And this is really the traditional understanding of things that was ruptured in the modern age, especially with Cartesianism. And you get this view of the world where there are two irreducible substances. There is the outside material world, there's matter, and then there is the interior subjective world of the psyche, and neither one is reducible to the other. Now, this is really the whole basis for the modern understanding of the world, and the modern project is a wholly inductive model of research combined with a totally mechanistic view of nature. And in this picture, what looked like elements of nature misattributed to the human intellect are removed, like the idea of final causes, formal causes, purpose at all in nature. Now, when people like Francis Bacon were promoting the scientific method and promoting this use of inductive reasoning, this was never intended to serve as a metaphysic. But for the purposes of the scientific method, the interior, the subjective, was placed in a separate domain. But it was kind of inevitable that this pragmatic step would turn into a kind of metaphysics. And this kind of radical dualism, this radical separation.
That's what I call the lab leak. This is idea. It was never intended to be a metaphysic, but it got out and it became a metaphysic.
Of the interior and the exterior, the objective and the subjective, has become a popular metaphysic. And this lends itself quite well to the idea that the interior self needs to be liberated from the constraints of the physical world.
Okay, now this is this liberationism that gets going in the 60s. And he walks through it quite nicely in this Wokeism and Our Transhuman Future video, and the link will be in the bottom notes.
And that liberation, the purpose of that liberation is to give that interior self a free, open space of possibility. So,
now this will set up all sorts of dualisms which get tremendously ironic, because again, we just listened to Tom Holland talk about Well, in some ways, the will of God is made manifest in karma. And then in Christianity, this gets inverted. No, it's God's preferential option for the poor. The will of God is made explicit in the cross. Now, it was very interesting because in some of the synod class, so we had 2 ministerial candidates being examined, and there was a fair amount of flag waving around penal substitutionary atonement, which is a big deal in the Christian Reformed Church, given the fact that the Heidelberg Catechism is probably the most beloved of the Christian Reformed Church's confessional documents. And the Heidelberg Catechism quite nicely lays out substitutionary atonement there. Yet, these are someone then asked about the resurrection. Oh, because Christianity so often does this, where on one hand, the cruciform Christ, and on the copy on the front of Tom Holland's American edition, you've got Dolly's crucifixion. If you watch I use that cover a lot. And right there you have that emphasis. But in some ways, Christianity gets it both ways, because in the resurrection, you get the karmic emphasis that Jesus' sacrifice is vindicated and Jesus is finally victorious. And it's the same thing you have with the book of Revelation. And it's very interesting. Was it with Michaela and the Freedom Tunes video where Jordan Peterson once again made the comment that Carl Jung saw basically the book of Revelation as a counterbalance to the anti-karmic strain coming through in the Gospels with the crucifixion of Jesus. And so then what we have is this split we have these strange dualities that arise, and we have a certain splitness by which now in our current iteration, because of our skepticism about, let's say, a post-second coming or even a post-death reward and eschatology and culmination of rightness and justice in the life of the age to come or in the life to come, now in wokeness it all must come here, which is so incredibly interesting, because what we have is we have these dualities and we just keep switching sides between them.
But it seems to me that essentially the culture wars are arguments over theology, where one side isn't recognizing the fact that actually it's a theological argument, because the fundamentals of anti-racism, of gay rights, of trans rights, of feminism are all rooted in the Christian assumption that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The idea that, you know, it's better to be the victim than the victimizer.
But part of what happens then in the wokeness is, well, kingdom must come here and now. And as I've said many times, often if you try to pull down heaven, you're probably going to bring up hell. And this is what we've had in many utopian. It was pretty amazing to hear John Vervaeke and my conversation with him and J.P. Marceau notice how brutal many of these utopian schemes are. Well, then what to do with the religious? What to do with it? Because if you want a religion that's not a religion, well, what kind of utopia are you going to bring? Will it be a political utopia? And again, these tensions are all in the gospel. And if you go back a year or so, when you get into, so in the New Testament, you've got the state of the culture war in Judea and the Galilee of the Jews under Roman oppression and the desire to be liberated from Roman oppression and the desire to see Jesus as their liberator. And Jesus just seems to not get it. But then now you've got Paul going out into the Roman Empire. And what exactly is the nature of this liberation? And then you have John in the book of Revelation telling the 7 churches in Asia Minor, oh, don't worry, we'll win. And of course, if you say this at the end of the 1st century, that sounds like crazy talk. But by the 3rd century, it's coming around. But what really does winning look like?
And Nietzsche, the great atheist enemy of Christianity, who attacks for things that he hates the idea of victimhood, that the idea that victimhood should be privileged. He despises that. I mean, he would absolutely recognize it as being Christian. And I think, I talked about how when you're crucified, the sufferer, you die because you can't breathe. And I would say that George Floyd absolutely fits into the Christ-shaped gap that, this new evolving theology needs. It needs martyrs. It needs people who embody fundamental Christian principles, but who aren't necessarily Christian, or indeed, it's great if they're not Christian.
It already said right there. We got to go back to that, because you need, again, back to the Peugeot Roland thing. You need saints to instantiate the world and make it believable. And of course, George Floyd fits that bill. But because of the universalism,
because then evolving theology needs it needs martyrs. It needs people who embody fundamental Christian principles, but who aren't necessarily Christian, or indeed, it's great if they're not Christian. Because
back to the George Yancey book, where, well, what is the difference between these progressive Christians and the conservative Christians? Well, the progressive Christians, the main outgroup for many of the progressive Christians are the conservative Christians. They're easier to build bonds with people who are not Christian because that validates their narrative. And if you go back to the wokeness and transhumanism video, well, part of what's happening is you have to, now the word Gnostic here is sort of complex because of where that has gone on in terms of historical conversations. David Bentley Hart, if you read his Substack lately, he's been commenting quite a bit on the changing developments of the view of Gnosticism. But for lack of a better word, you have the secret sacred self, which is not instantiate, which basically the religious obligation is to instantiate individually the secret sacred self and express it. And what that means is that it's even more religious and more powerful if you can express it against the confines of physicality. Therefore, the transgender and transhuman are beyond, in a way that, if you can be a trans woman who is hotter than Kim Kardashian, you have arrived. That's sort of the natural logic of the religion.
Because then they can serve as kind of more potent figures to rally the cause. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I would, if I were an American evangelical, I would probably focus on what unites rather than what divides.
It's interesting to go into this question of powerlessness as at the heart of the gospel. And
now again, back to Anabaptism. Okay, this long tradition of victimhood. The Anabaptists just they're not quite up to the level of Jews of becoming victims of Western civilization, but they're second or third because they're pacifists. And when the towers come down, the person even more hated than the people who did it are your supposed friends and allies who won't stand with you. And so George W. Bush gets on the phone and basically calls around this world and says, there are two lists here. We're on one and Al-Qaeda is the other. Tell me which list you're on. And if you're on this list, you're going to instantiate your commitment to us by joining in the coalition of the willing. And of course, the UK is, the US and the UK shoulder to shoulder. So
identification with the powerless as central to Christianity. There have,
especially if you're an Anabaptist,
been movements, as you know better than we, over the course of Christianity that sought to recover that sought to get back to that original nonviolent ethic of the first few generations of Christianity. This magazine actually is published by an Anabaptist community.
Yeah. I knew it was back in there for a reason. So this is published by an Anabaptist community. This is the heart of our expression.
For instance. And although we publish Ecumenical Voices, in fact, our last podcast episode we had on Pater Edmund Waldstein, a well-known Catholic integralist who loves the idea of Christendom and its restoration.
Which is, again, the Anabaptists understand this is contra to our narrative.
There is this strain of within Christianity, sort of a centuries-long fight, so to speak, between this impulse to nonviolence towards taking on suffering, a willingness to bear suffering, and then the desire for domination that goes with the universalist claims of Christianity. And I just wonder,
yes, indeed. There it is, right there. You said it well.
I'd be nonviolence restoration. There is this strain of within Christianity, sort of a centuries-long fight, so to speak, between this impulse to nonviolence towards taking on suffering, a willingness to bear suffering, and then the desire for domination that goes with the universalist claims of Christianity. And I just wonder, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this whole question of sort of violence and nonviolence within Christianity, and what role does that play in what we're talking about?
Clearly, the tradition of nonviolence is very, very significant. Jesus allows himself to be arrested. He tells Peter to put up his sword. He goes to his death rather than summon angels to defend him. And you can see in early medieval writings where newly converted Germanic peoples are trying to make sense of this, just how odd it is. So they'll cast, the apostles as a kind of band of warriors with Christ as the warlord, and the radicalism of the fact that this warlord refuses to fight again and again is what obsesses them. They completely recognize how odd this is. But against that,
and if you watch, I haven't kept up with Vikings, but if you watch Vikings, I mean, these themes come about again and again and again in the conflict of cultures between, let's say, the Christians in medieval England and the invading Danes or the Vikings. This comes up again and again. What kind of God is a loser? And yet he just seems to keep winning. How does this work?
It's important to recognize that there is also scope if you want to fight for doing that. There's lots of violence. Say, just the Book of Revelation is an astonishingly violent text, and the fact that it's an anti-imperial text. I mean, I would say the greatest anti-imperial text ever written, the text that underlies the great tradition of anti-imperialism within Western thought.
Now, anti-human imperialism, this is heaven's imperialist manifesto that, hey, Jesus is coming on a white horse with his hosts, and the great and small of the earth will cry to the mountains to fall upon them, to hide them from the face of the one on the throne and the Lamb. It just... how can you say this book isn't inspired? It just keeps on giving.
It doesn't mean that it's not incredibly violent. It's absolutely kind of soused in the blood of,
the blood runs deep in the Book of Revelation.
Damned.
A lot of Frantz Fanon in there. The wretched of the earth rising up.
Absolutely. Well, and it's there in Anabaptism, isn't it? Because
but it's not the wretched of the earth rising up. It's the Lord and his hosts not coming to sing over fields of Bethlehem, but coming with their swords out to say, okay, Rome, your time is done. We have a lake of fire. Let's get on with it. But that's not, breaking off our chains below in order to rise up and control the means of production.
Anabaptists become famously pacifist, but Munster is the absolute archetype of what happens when you take the Book of Revelation too seriously. So,
But don't say Munster, Jan of Leiden, please, no.
We quickly disclaimed those Munsterites.
Sure, but it was the scope was there, wasn't it? So and that's part of what makes Christianity so, I think, culturally, emotionally, spiritually satisfying to human beings. If you're looking at it purely from a kind of a Darwinian sense, why has it worked? Why has it become the most successful way of explaining what humans are about that's ever existed? It's that kind of tension. There's something for everyone there, but it's channeled in kind of very, very distinctive ways. So I would say that the relationship of violence and non-violence within the Christian tradition has always been a kind of one that generates sparks, put it that way. But I think there's another perspective which kind of ties in with what you were saying about Catholic yearning for Christendom as was, which I think has been highlighted by the recent
and now Orthodox yearning for Christendom
meeting that's taken place in Hungary between the Pope and Viktor Orban.
Now, again, if you follow Rod Dreher, a lot of attention to Viktor Orban.
Because those two men embody two traditions, again, that are very, very ancient and both deeply Christian. So the Pope embodies the kind of universalist strain within Christianity, the all human beings are created equal, that cultural difference will ultimately be dissolved within Christ. And it's that message that of course that underlies the evangelism that has seen Christianity brought to continents that would have been unimaginable to the apostles, the first apostles. Against that, Viktor Orban is equally an embodiment of a Christian tradition that sees Christianity as something that needs to be defended from its enemies. So he's the leader of a country that was occupied by the Ottomans for many centuries, and therefore has a kind of attitude towards particularly Muslim migrants that is explicitly hostile. He sees Islam as a threat to Christianity, as Christians have seen Islam as a threat for most of their existence, and so
most of Islam's existence.
Essentially, what's at stake is an argument, I think, about about the Good Samaritan. With the Good Samaritan, the obligation laid on the Christ's story of the Good Samaritan lays on Christians is to care for those who may not even be Christian. That's how it's traditionally been interpreted. But I suppose what the Viktor Orban tradition is, yes, but what if the Good Samaritan, what if the person that you've rescued turns out to be a Viking, or turns out to be an Ottoman or a Janissary or whatever? What are you going to do then? It's ridiculous to pretend that the desire to defend Christianity, or indeed to spread Christianity at the point of a sword, is not a part of Christian history, because it clearly is.
One of the things that we're seeing a lot of in the US, I think possibly somewhat less in the UK, is the emergence of what you might call the post-Christian right. So, there was a lot of talk about the Christian right. I did not grow up Christian. I can remember hearing about the Christian right as this very scary thing when I was growing up.
She did not grow up Christian. She heard about the Christian right as a scary thing. They're obviously watching. It gives you an idea about probably the political orientation of her parents, perhaps. I don't know her story. But also it's interesting that, Anabaptism would certainly be, if you're sort of all about the universalism and the peace and justice, Anabaptism sort of fits into that.
We're now kind of seeing a little bit of what might be called a post-Christian right, which is reaching back, it thinks at least, through Nietzsche to some of the kind of earlier, Bronze Age, yeah, to the Bronze Age. as an actual historian of, among other ages, the Bronze Age, can you talk about what are the without Christian assumptions, without the Christian assumptions that especially those on the progressive left may not even recognize that they have, what would, a non-Christian Western mind look like?
Well, I think the key figure here is Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's great insight is that most of the movements within Western history that had sought to extirpate Christian were themselves incredibly Christian. So the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Russian Revolution hadn't happened when Nietzsche died, but communism. That if you're saying, again, to reiterate, the first shall be last, and that those who are oppressed have value by virtue of being oppressed, which is kind of fundamental to the French Revolution and to the communist tradition. If you're saying that idols should be overthrown and superstition should be banished, because by doing that you will bring people into the light, so people who walk in darkness will be brought into light, then again it's just another reincarnation of Christian assumptions. And so the Enlightenment as well is just another...
and I think you could throw some Barfieldian aspects of some Barfieldianism in there into the Enlightenment conversation.
Turning of that great kind of Christian wheel. It's just you're not escaping from Christian assumptions. And so both the Enlightenment and the kind of the socialist and the communist traditions within the West are just further iterations of Christianity. And that's Nietzsche's kind of great insight, because he emotionally and intellectually and spiritually identifies with the world that preceded Christianity. He identifies with the kind of the warrior values of Greece and of Rome, and he mourns their loss. He regrets the fact that the blonde beast has been tamed and tonsured and locked up in a monastery. He wants to see God properly dead. Because in the famous parable that he tells, and it's interesting, even Nietzsche can't escape it, because he's telling a parable as Christ did. I mean, it's even Nietzsche can't escape it. The corpse of God is so massive that it continues to cast shadows on the cave. But he says that the time will come where the corpse of God will go, and a new age will be born, and this new age will be drenched in blood and spectacles of great terror and wonder. And of course, that is what comes to pass, because we know, as Nietzsche didn't, what will follow in the decades that come after his death. And in a sense, fascism is the first attempt to repudiate Christianity, not just institutionally, but doctrinally. Because what let's say the two great revolutionary principles that underpin Christianity, and they both have precedence in things that exist before Christianity, but no framework of belief fuses them quite so potently as Christianity. One is absolutely the sense that to be weak, to suffer, dignifies you and imposes an obligation on the strong to care for you. And the other is that all human beings have a fundamental dignity, and that there is no Jew or Greek. And fascism repudiates these, and fascism fuses the antique. So the very name fascism comes from the fasces, which are the bundles of rods and axes that the bodyguards of first the consuls and then the emperors carry over their shoulders. And it fuses that kind of identification with the ancient, with the pre-Christian world of Greece and Rome, with the very modern. So Mussolini is obsessed with planes and cars and tanks. And in the form of Nazism in particular, this attempt to repudiate those core Christian values attains its kind of horrific apotheosis. So obviously Hitler doesn't think that the strong owe a duty of care to the weak. He thinks that they have a responsibility to crush the weak. You know, he casts the weak as the equivalent of microbes who have to be eliminated.
And it's helpful to remember that this is an evolutionary vision, that this is in fact the way history is supposed to work for the sake of the strength of the strong.
He's not doing what he does because he's evil. He's doing it because he thinks what he's doing is right. It's a new way of seeing the world. It's a new way of calibrating values. And likewise, he sees it as his responsibility to affirm and protect and enhance the purity of what he sees as his race. So of course he sees Jews and Greeks as being different. And indeed, he sees, you know, the question that haunts him, he sees the Jews, he sees the Romans and the Greeks as being Aryan, of Aryan stock. And so the question he has to ask is, well, what went wrong? Why did they fall? And the answer is that they get corrupted by the rootless cosmopolitanism of the Jew Paul, as he calls him. And so if his Reich is going to last for 1,000 years, the Nazis have to do what the Romans failed to do, which is to get rid of the Jews. So the most, you know, I talked about the history of Christianity being a history of paradoxes. That's perhaps the most hideous paradox of all, that the Jews are targeted for genocide because Hitler blames them for Christianity. Even as, of course, he's drawing on the tropes of anti-Semitism that 2,000 years of Christianity have given him. Now, Nazism doesn't prevail. You know, the 1,000-year Reich doesn't last for 1,000 years. And the Second World War is won by people who do it in the name of Christian civilization. But I think that the effect of this is, in a sense, certainly in Europe, in the decades that follow the end of the Second World War, to make institutional Christianity almost unnecessary, because what it's done is to create a new myth in which Hitler is the devil and the Nazis are the demons and Auschwitz is hell. And in a sense, that replaces the old supernatural structures, you know, of heaven and hell, of angels and demons.
These are the instantiations in the world. These are the saints
that had previously existed. And in a sense, they're kind of more vivid. Everyone's obsessed by Nazis. Everyone's obsessed by the Second World War. You know, it's kind of an enduring obsession. And whereas previously people might say, well, what would Jesus do and do it? Now we say, what would Hitler do and do the opposite? But of course,
and this gets back to an observation by G.K. Chesterton that the good is terribly different to know, and so what we usually take is the bad and we do the opposite. That's exactly what we've done here. Let's do the opposite of Hitler.
Of course, it remains a deeply Christian way of seeing the world, because we cast the Nazis as the essence, the quintessence of evil, because they offended the core Christian assumptions that have governed, you know, the way that the West interprets and understands the world for, you know, 1,000, 1,500 years. So in a sense,
it's again one of these ideas that, what video was it that I was talking about this? That there are these ideas that come along that so completely conquer that everything after them is redefined by them, and that's what Christianity does.
If there are people who are harking back to the Bronze Age, I mean that is a kind of that's a proper repudiation of Christianity. That's not a kind of repudiation of Christianity in the way that the progressive radicals are doing it. That's a kind of Nietzschean repudiation, and it's one that is casting off, that's scorning the idea that the history of fascism shows where that leads.
It's interesting to sort of think about Hitler as the sort of Satan figure of, you know, our contemporary culture, because there's not really a corresponding Christ figure, or at least there's not a single corresponding Christ figure. Like, you don't say, what would Churchill do? Because especially, you know, to a lot of modern progressives, you know, Churchill is not actually someone to look up to. So there's this kind of free...
Now again, these are Anabaptists talking. Now, there's actually a really wonderful dual biography of Churchill and Gandhi, and I should, again, probably take a look at that again, because it's very interesting the way. Well, maybe I'll pull a few little quotes of that up. The irony here again is that there's it must have been in the Salamis and Thermopylae podcast where Churchill came up again in The Rest is History between Dominic and Tom Holland. Here in this book, Gandhi and Churchill, the epic rivalry that destroyed an empire and forged our age. Gandhi's, look at the relationship between Gandhi and Hitler. It's fascinating. In 1938, he had urged the Czechs to use nonviolence against the Germans instead of bullets. He urged German Jews to do the same. The Jews of Germany can offer, it's been a while since I've listened to this stuff and lost the pronunciation. Basically, Gandhi's idea of soul force. And in this way, Gandhi is sort of a Hindu Anabaptist, can offer soul force under infinitely better auspices than Indians in South Africa. He wrote in Harijan on November 11, 1938, they are more gifted than the Indians of South Africa. He's writing of the Jews of Germany. And again, this part of I commented recently about the Scopes trial, and someone in the YouTube comment says, have you ever looked up the textbooks that they were fighting about in the Scopes trial? And I probably should. Said they would be, they would be thrown away because of the sort of the prevalence of pre-World War II eugenics, absolution, social Darwinist thought. And here you find it in some ways in the mouth of Gandhi. They are more gifted than the Indians of South Africa. A calm and determined stand offered by unarmed men and women could turn their winter of despair into a summer of hope. This is Gandhi advising the Jews of Germany. Gandhi felt it would win the world's admiration, perhaps even that of the German people. The German Jews will score a lasting victory over the German Gentiles, in the sense that they will have converted the latter into an appreciation of human dignity. Gandhi even urged the Jews to disarm their persecutors by praying for Hitler. If even one Jew acted thus, he said confidently, he would save his self-respect and leave an example which, if it became infectious, would save the whole of Jewry. No. Again, I mean, Jesus is a Jew. Jesus does this. Jesus dies, but Jesus is risen. Even his old friend Herman Kallenbach had to demur. Herman wants to be nonviolent, says Gandhi's explanation for their disagreement. But the sufferings of his fellow Jews are too much to bear, Gandhi added. I do not quarrel with him over his anger. But then he repeated the aphorism that revenge is sweet, but forgiveness is divine. This is Gandhi. Even after the war, when the full extent of the Holocaust became known, Gandhi still felt that Jews should have offered themselves into the butcher's knife. They should have thrown themselves into the sea from cliffs. It would have aroused the world and the people of Germany. As it is, they succumbed anyway in their millions. In the shadow of Treblinka and Auschwitz, or even Kristallnacht, Gandhi's remarks seem extraordinary, even obscenely naive. In the same way, his ambivalent views of Hitler shocked even his supporters. In July 23, 1939, he had written an open letter to Hitler begging him to renounce violence. You are not understanding Hitler at all. It is clear that you are today one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to the savage state, it read. Will you listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war? Hitler, of course, did not. But that did not stop Gandhi from sending the dictator more letters in May and June of 1940, or from telling Linlithgow that same month, Hitler is not a bad man. As Hitler's panzers roared across France, Gandhi wrote that future generations of Germans would honor Herr Hitler as a genius, as a brave man, as a matchless organizer, and much more. In his last missive to Hitler, written the day before Christmas 1941, Gandhi praised your bravery and devotion to your fatherland, nor do we believe that you are the monster described by your opponents, one of his most vocal being Winston Churchill.
Floating Christ mantle, Christ figure. Like, you don't say what needs. It's interesting to sort of think about Hitler as the sort of Satan figure of, our contemporary culture, because there's not really a corresponding Christ figure, or at least there's not a single corresponding Christ figure. Like, you don't say.
I would say that many would say, well, certainly Gandhi must be there.
Say, what would Churchill do? Because especially, to a lot of modern progressives, Churchill is not actually someone to look up to. So there's this kind of free-floating Christ mantle that it seems to me, although, Hitler can stay as the devil, there's a kind of free-floating.
Well, I think it's been vested in people who are classed as victims.
I'm interested in the way that Dominion's been kind of received. I've seen it called a revisionist history, and obviously there's this. I love the fact that the British publisher kind of tried to cloak it a bit. What's been the strangest response, or what's been like? Obviously, I know like a ton of Christians who absolutely love the book for incredibly obvious reasons. What's been the response among non-Christians? Like, have you felt them puzzled?
There's been a fair degree of hostility from some, because in a sense I'm a kind of apostate, I suppose. I remember, I wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Sword, which was about the emergence of Islam as an imperial project that emerged from the imperial traditions of late antiquity, so the Roman and Sasanian traditions. And to explain it historically essentially required me to question quite a lot about the life of Muhammad and the origins of the Quran, that obviously is very, very important to Muslims. I mean, it kind of lies at the heart of what Muslims believe. And I remember giving a talk where a Muslim in the audience said, why have you done this? Why are you questioning what we hold sacred? You would never do this to yourself. And I felt that the force of that, because actually at that point I was already questioning what I took to be sacred, which was basically that I was a liberal, that there were such things as human rights, that they were uncomplicated, that I was a product of the Enlightenment, that I owed more to Greece and Rome than I did to dreary old church fathers and monks and all that kind of dreadful crew who'd ruined everything, as was, the kind of Gibbonian stereotype. I was already doubting that. But that question kind of, I felt the force of it, and I thought, well, I'm going to question my values and beliefs and mythology, if you like, in exactly the same way. So really, Dominion is the fruit of that. And so I can see why there are liberals who have a kind of particular emotional investment in the idea of the Enlightenment as, an emancipation from the Dark Ages and from barbarism and super.
Harris, Shermer, Rat Rules. Yeah, they're out there. They're noisy. They're still making noise.
And all that kind of thing. I mean, I can see why they would resent that. But I have to say that nobody has objected to this in quite the way that people objected to the book on Islam. And I think that probably reflects the fact that for most people, the stakes are less high.
And Christianity has built into it all of this paradox, and we're sort of used to dealing with it. And we've created a tradition where at least at this point so far, we're not killing over it.
Tom, thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So there it is. So, yep, second round. It's from an Anabaptist community. And, again, if you know anything about Julian in our little corner of the internet, Julian's one of the sharper tools, even if he's spending most of his time with tools, welding dumpsters and working out his salvation with his hands and with his mind in his Hutterite community. So just wanted to get some of these things out there, get some of these things down, incorporating some other podcasts. There obviously is a coming publication of the conversation between Peterson, Barron, Peugeot, and Vervaeke. I will be all over that. But I've got a lot of other things that I continue to think about and put out there. So thanks for listening. Leave a comment.